The Adventures of a Newcomer. Hey, if you could give my podcast a thumbs up on YouTube or share it with a friend, I'd appreciate it. Thanks. Chapter 9, in which Ethelred finds it hard to sleep undisturbed. I wonder whether he intends to come, said Professor Pattersole, better known as Peter Sullivan, to Edward Land, the other pseudo-professor. I think so. He has no idea of a college nor of college boys. And if he has been quiet thus far, no one will be likely to enlighten him. The two were standing at the appointed spot awaiting Ethelred. It was a dark night, and the wind sweeping down from the north in icy blasts made the place very uncomfortable for a rendezvous. The thermometer, steadily falling throughout the day, was now very near to zero mark. The two were chafing their ears and stamping their feet upon the ground. "Isn't it getting cold?" asked Sullivan. "If he doesn't come pretty quickly, I'll clear out. A joke's a good thing, but I don't suppose to freeze to death for the sake of a laugh. But it will be rich, and I hope our friend Mr. Hale will not take it amiss." "I don't see why he should. He likes a joke himself. If he thinks he can present me with a package of cigarettes with sawdust inside of them without my getting back at him, he's mistaken. I haven't forgotten the time when he sent me a box of cigars, upper row, all right, the rest of it a collection of tracts on the evil of using fermented wine. There's hardly a boy in the upper classes, continued Land, that he hasn't worked on, one way or another. That bottle of anti-fat, which came to Fatty Archibald on his last birthday, has been traced to Mr. Hale." "Is that so? Last time he played a practical joke on me, he told me that if I ever got the chance, I might return him the favor, and now, oh, here comes the victim." Breathing heavily, Ethelred at this point joined them. "What's the matter?" "You're all out of breath, my son," said Sullivan. "I had a little trouble to get away." Ethelred did not think it best to go into details. Before leaving the junior division, he had thought proper to mete out vengeance upon Peter Lane. Hurrying from the study hall and awaiting for the little Peter to pass, he followed him till they were in a part of the yard where shadows were thickest, and then, catching the little man, proceeded to shake him with all his strength. Had Ethelred been content to nourish his design in secret, all would have gone well for him and ill for Peter. But he had hinted his plan earlier in the evening to Earl, who, in consequence, was on the lookout. He had secretly put hands upon Peter when he was seized by a strong pair of arms from behind and jerked backwards with a force that brought his jaws together with a force that would have given 9 students out of 10 a violent headache. It did not affect Ethelred in that way, however, but it made him feel decidedly uncomfortable. "Run off, Peter," said Earl. He continued as Peter disappeared from view. "Ethelred, you're a coward. The idea of picking on the smallest boy in the yard. If you go on this way, there's not a boy here that will have anything to do with you. I don't care. Let go of me, will you? Let go. I won't touch him. Ow, stop squeezing." Released, Ethelred rubbed his arms. They were destined to show blue marks for a week in consequence of that squeeze. Earl, strong above his years and weight, had a grip that was extraordinary. "Well, good night," said Earl shortly, turning on his heels. Ethelred paused to invoke some, let us say, blessings on Earl's head, and then suddenly remembering his appointment, hastened away. All these things, it is hardly necessary to say, the pseudo-professors learned only on the following morning. "Well, my son," said Edward, "we find on examination that it won't do for you to go to sleep in the dormitory tonight. Some of the young gentlemen here will become jealous of you, unless we prepare the way gently for your promotion to the senior division. Your admission, accordingly, to the senior division must be kept a secret till tomorrow afternoon, or possibly till tomorrow night." "Yes," said Ethelred. So we have decided to allow you to private sleeping room for this night. Come on at once, and don't talk on the way." Crossing the yard, they came to the infirmary building. It was a long, low structure, 2 stories in height, with the windows of the first floor about 9 feet above the ground, avoiding the entrance. Ethelrod's guides conducted him to a ladder below the 3rd window on the western side. "Now be quiet," whispered Sullivan. "We want no one to know that you are here, else they might try to play tricks on you. Follow me up the ladder until into this room." Sullivan mounted, followed by Ethelrod and Edward. The room was exquisitely fitted up. A student's lamp upon the center table was alight. At the time that they entered and threw a softened splendor upon the entire room, there were tidies, silk hangings, doilies, lace pillow slips, silken curtains, books selected seemingly for their pretty covers, and upon the toilet table a number of dainty articles. "How do you like this?" asked Sullivan, removing the rose-colored shade from the lamp. For answer, Ethelrod gazed about him, open-mouthed. "Now, boy, you are to touch nothing in this room except the lamp, which you will blow out as soon as you have undressed, and then go to bed, and stay there till we come for you tomorrow morning." "Yes, sir." "If any people should come in here during the night, don't you let them impose on you. However, there does not seem to be any danger. The door, you will observe, is locked. When Professor Salvini and I go, which we shall do by means of the window, so as to keep your being here a secret from the boys, many of whom, I regret to say, are frivolous, we shall take away the step-ladder. So you ought to be quite safe from intruders. Still, if anyone should come in, don't let him impose upon you." "I'll bet I won't. They're not going to fool me." "Good night, my boy. Go to bed." And the 2 professors departed by the window. 1 hour later, Mr. Hale, who had been downtown to see certain friends of his, returned, caroling lightly to his room in the infirmary. Mr. Hale was a tall, willowy young exquisite of 21, with a light mustache, a delicate complexion, and dainty cane. He wore an abundance of rings. Despite his appearance, he was a sensible young man, who gave pleasure to many by his kindly ways, and with the trifling exception of 1 or 2 upon whom he had played practical jokes, offense to none. He resided at Henryton College in the capacity of teacher of flute and piano. Unlocking himself into his room, he lighted the lamp, took off his coat, and put a cigar in his mouth. It was his custom before retiring to while away an hour over a mild Havana. Having struck a match and settled into his armchair, he waited for the blue flame to burn away. And while he was thus waiting, his jaw dropped, his eyes opened wide. He jumped from his chair with a start, and was in 2 minds about rushing from the room. Beside the bed was a chair on which were piled a shirt, trousers, coat, and vest. Upon the pillow, his beautiful lace pillow, lay a strange head. After breathing hard for a minute, Mr. Hale, with trembling fingers, struck another match, lighted his lamp, and, arming himself with his cane, resolved to explore this mystery. "Hey!" he cried, entrenched behind his chair, standing at a safe distance from the bed. "Wake up there! Who are you?" Master Ethelred tossed uneasily, gave a groan, and was still again. "Hey there! Wake up! Do you hear?" No attention was paid to these remonstrances. Then Mr. Hale did what was for him a bold thing. Stooping down, he picked up a slipper from under his washstand and tossed it lightly into the air. It fell, striking the sleeper's neck. Ethelrod, rubbing his eyes, sat up in bed. "What are you doing in this room, sir?" stuttered Mr. Hale. "None of your business. You just clear out of here and let me alone." "But," gasped the astonished musician, "this is my room." "See here," said Ethelred fiercely, You can't fool me because I'm a newcomer. You just clear out of this room right smart, or it will be the worse for you." "You imprudent fellow!" cried Mr. Hale, his anger growing as his courage rose. "If you don't get out of that bed at once and leave this room with those clothes of yours, I'll cane you." And he shook his dainty walking stick at the occupant of his bed. "You just come near enough," roared Ethelrod, reaching down and recovering one of his shoes, "and I'll stave in your old head. You can't play any tricks on me." At this point it occurred to Mr. Hale that he must be dealing with an escaped lunatic. He resolved to change his tactics. "But my dear sir," he urged, "that's my bed." "You just get out of this room as quick as you can," returned Ethelrod, "or I'll tell the professors on you." "What professors?" "Professors Pattersole and Salvini." Mr. Hale was now convinced that he had to deal with a lunatic. There were no professors answering to such names in the college. "Get out," he roared, hoping to frighten the invader by the fierceness of his tones. "Get out yourself, you idiot!" squawked Ethelrod at the top of his voice. There had been a noise and pattering of footsteps outside during the foregoing dialogue. As Ethelrod's voice ceased, there came a knock. "Come in," cried Mr. Hale, inwardly thinking that help had arrived. The door opened, and the face of Brother Infirmarian came into view. "No, you don't come in," wailed Ethelrod. "You're not going to work on me. Get out of here, both of you." The brother now entered, and behind him, arrayed in their nightshirts and armed with sticks, shoes, pokers, and one baseball bat, patted 6 little barefoot boys. Their eyes were sticking out from curiosity. The new arrivals were not long in appreciating the situation. Mr. Hale, still standing behind his chair, as though it were a rampart, was brandishing his cane. Ethelrod, sitting up in bed, was holding a shoe, ready to throw at a moment's notice. "There's a lunatic in that bed!" exclaimed the teacher of music. "Lunatic? You old redhead," retorted Ethelrod. "I've got more sense than your whole family." "Why," exclaimed one of the young gentlemen in white, "it's Ethelrod Preston, his mamma darling." At this, all of the white-robed ones broke into a laugh, so heartily that one would find it hard to believe that they were the small boy of the junior division who, too ill to attend to regular work. It was Haynes, temporarily indisposed by a headache, who recognized Ethelrod. The 5 other boys, having been sick all that day, had not had the pleasure thus far of meeting the darling. But Haynes, during the 2 hours before bedtime, had told them enough of him to make this first moment of recognition a moment of ecstasy, which they were not likely to forget. "Come, sir," said the brother infirmarian, "get up out of that." To the horror of the 6 little boys, Ethelrod put his thumb to his nose and wiggled his fingers in scorn. "I told you he was crazy," said Mr. Hale. "You people don't take me in," said Ethelrod. "Get out of this room. I wasn't born yesterday." The brother was becoming angry. "Get out yourself, sir, or we shall have to recourse to physical force." Before Ethelrod could answer, another person arrived on the scene. It was Father Howard. "Oh, here you are," he said. "Why didn't you go to your dormitory? Your prefect reported you to me for being absent, and I've been looking for you since 9 o'clock. Ethelrod became subdued at once. "Professors Pattersole and Salvini told me to come here." If there was a twinkle in Father Howard's eye for a moment, let us trust that it was not recorded by the angel who keeps count and tally against disciplinarians. "Go to your bed, boys," said Father Howard to the white-robed array. They disappeared promptly, throwing wistful, lingering, longing looks over their shoulders. "Now, sir, put on your clothes at once, and I'll take you to your dormitory. The professors you mentioned are not to be found in this college. You have been duped." It was 3 months before Mr. Hale was able to see the joke in this little episode. Then he saw it and forgave the perpetrators. It was also 1 month before Professor Pattersole and Silvini had fully squared accounts with Father Howard. Chapter 10, in which Earl Merriweather receives another public admonition. On the following day, which was the last Friday in January, and the second day in Ethelred Preston's career as a student in Henryton College, the newcomer went about more quietly. He had learned from his first experience that in entering upon college, life has been brought into relation with other boys which were quite different from what he had expected. It had been his intention to borrow money from everyone who was willing to lend, but Devereux and Merriweather, by their remarks on the previous afternoon, had caused him to change his mind. His fellow students, satisfied with the preceding day's fun, were content, for the time being at least, to let him alone. So the morning and afternoon wore off without a break in the calm flow of college life. During the recesses and recreations, Ethelred clung to Earl. He was the only boy in the college whom Ethelred cared about consorting with. "You see," he explained, as he gave Earl a dig in the ribs, "we're both Protestants. I don't like these Catholics." This remark fell upon Earl like a blow. It hurt his pride that he should be put on the same footing with Preston. He knew, of course, that Preston was by no means a representative of the Protestant boy, and that his Protestantism was rather a hatred of Catholicism than any set form of worship. And yet this remark of Ethelred's galled him, and awoke in him the old feeling of religious unrest. "If you don't like these Catholics so much, the worse for you," answered Earl. "I know most of them, and they're pretty well. I can tell you that there are some fellows here in this school who are leading lives as beautiful as the lives of the best people I ever read about in books." "You're a little hypocrite," objected Ethelred. "Oh, of course. In all the time that I've been attending school here, I never met a good-for-nothing fellow, yet who didn't explain the conduct of those who acted decently on the ground of hypocrisy. That's a cheap way of showing jealousy or spite. I don't believe there are many hypocrites among boys, at least little boys. And when you do come upon a hypocrite, you find him out pretty soon. But when you are thrown in with a boy day in day out for weeks and months, and notice that he will never do anything that he thinks is really wrong, it's nonsense to say that he's a hypocrite." "Well," said Preston, "I haven't seen any of your pious boys around here. They don't seem to show any religion at all. Now, there's that Devereux. You don't call him a pious boy." "Yes, but I do. There's not a better boy going. He was not remarkably good when he first came here from Philadelphia, but he changed inside of a month, and now he's next door to a saint." "You're a fool," said the gentle Ethelred in a croak. "That fellow pious? Why, he laughs and jokes and skips around lively. Look at him now, over there in that crowd. He's pushing and tugging and getting all the fun he can." "I'm afraid you don't know much about piety, Ethelred." "I guess I know a heap more about it than you do. I've been to camp meetings lots of times, and I've seen the pious people there. I've seen 'em on the platform and off it. They don't go about laughing and hopping and grinning. No, sir, you can just bet your boots. They look solemn and sad, and they talk that way, and they're just death on smoking and dancing and amusements and jokes and card-playing. You don't catch them playing any jokes. Why, I can tell a pious feller as soon as I see him." "So," said Earl, amused in spite of himself, "you don't think a person can be pious and cheerful at the same time?" "Not much." And Earl continued, "If a man wants to be pious according to your way of seeing it, he must not expect to enjoy himself or have any fun at all." "Why, that stands to reason. Anybody isn't a fool who can see that, answered Ethelred. I thought you were an Episcopalian. They don't talk as you do. The old woman is. At least, she says so. But I'm not. I'm a Protestant. And I know what they believe mighty well. Well, you're wrong. The best class of Protestants agree with Catholics on that point. A person, according to them, is really pious when he does his duty and avoids sin through supernatural motives. Now, a boy can do his duty and avoid sin at the same time and have a jolly good time, Ethelred snorted. If there's one thing I envy the Catholic boy, continued Earl, who was now talking on the subject which had lately absorbed his attention, it is confession. What? Squawked the darling. It is beautiful to see the effect it has on them. They go into the confessional for a few minutes and tell everything that is in their conscience to the priest. The priest sets them right if they need it, gives them good advice or encouragement when they are in trouble, and then gives them absolution. After that, a boy feels that he has a new start. Have you ever read The Horrors of the Confessing? Asked Ethelred. I don't want to read it. It's good. It's full of lively things. Them priests ought all to be hanged. The idea of them fellows pretending they can forgive sins, and then their masses. That's an invention of the devil. And what they call that holy come. You'd better stop, broke in Earl, with a strange light in his eyes. If there's one thing that has disgusted me with some people I have met who call themselves Protestants, it is the indecent and exaggerated way in which they talk about Catholic practices. Now take communion. I've seen boys make their first communion here twice, and I tell you, it's the nicest sight I want to see. When those little boys go to communion for their first time, some of them look like angels, and I'm sure if they were to die then, they would go straight to heaven. If people who call themselves Protestants know the good that confession and communion do to little boys, they wouldn't abuse these things, even if they do not believe in them. But Ethelred was not easily to be silenced on the question of religion. As he admitted in the course of the conversation, he made no pretense of being a professing Christian. At the same time, he had read and reread all manner of books containing attacks on the church, and he had, it would seem, attended the lectures of those highly delightful creatures, reformed priests, and escaped nuns. He was well armed, as he thought, for a vigorous onslaught on the Catholic Church and her ministers. And he poured into Earl's ear trite objections, stale slanders, and silly stories till Earl was too angry to reply. That afternoon in the classroom, Earl was more inattentive than ever. Some of Ethelred's objections to the Catholic faith were new to him, and despite himself, he kept turning them over in his mind. Yet turn them as he might, no satisfactory answers suggested themselves. His hand was drumming idly upon the desk, as his mind gave itself to these difficulties. The action of hand and brain were much involuntary. 5 lines for drumming, Merryweather, said Mr. Gade. Earl straightened up and bit his lip, while a shadow of annoyance passed over his face. The punishment was nothing extraordinary. There were several young gentlemen in the class given to beating the devil's tattoo in season and out, in consequence of which Mr. Gade had been obliged to declare it unlawful, and with a penalty of 5 lines to be memorized for each offense. In calling out Earl, Mr. Gade had used his severest tones instead of his usual matter-of-fact voice. It appeared to him that Earl was taking no pains to give satisfaction. This was the first time during the year that Earl had drummed upon his desk, and the teacher may be pardoned if, in the light of the preceding day's occurrence, he entertained a suspicion that the boy was trying to annoy him. Earl was hurt. Why could not his teacher treat him as he treats the others? "He's down on me," was his thought, and all the pride and vanity of his nature were again up in arms. Once these passions were awakened in our friend, they did not quickly subside. Slow to be aroused, he was slow to recover his usual equal mood. For the remainder of the hour Earl sat motionless, but his blood was boiling. The fierce play of passion within his heart was something that terrified him. He left the classroom with his face set and hardened. All thought of religion, of goodness, all sweet and holy sentiments were gone. He retired to a deserted walk, where he paced up and down like a caged tiger. At the end of class, Eddie Devereux remained at his desk, making a pretense of arranging his books and papers. When all had gone out, he approached Mr. Gade, blushing violently and very nervous. "Mr. Gade, you wouldn't mind my saying something, sir?" "Not at all, Eddie. I'm sure that you won't say anything very bad." "It's about Earl, sir." "Well, what about him?" At the mention of Earl's name, the smile of encouragement disappeared from the teacher's face. "I think, sir, he was trying to pay attention that day you sent him from the room." "It didn't look that way, Eddie. I'm afraid that you are prejudiced." "I'm his friend and loyal," Ed simply said, "and I know," he went on, "that Earl is a good boy. I think that he did more for me than any boy here when I first came. He gave me a little talk once because I wasn't behaving in chapel, and it made me so ashamed of myself that it was worth more to me than a dozen sermons. Please don't think hard of him, Mr. Gade. He's troubled about something. I'm sure he wasn't thinking of what he was doing when he was drumming this afternoon." Mr. Gade was secretly delighted with Eddie's loyalty to his friend. At that same time, he was decidedly of the opinion that Ed was mistaken in his estimate of Earl's conduct. As the reader knows, it was Mr. Gade who misjudged. It must be said in his defense, however, that owing to Earl's extreme reticence, he had nothing to judge from but the appearance of things. Ed, on the other hand, having heard Earl's story, was sufficiently aware of his friend's struggles and troubles to be thoroughly convinced of his good faith. Yet, knowing them in confidence, he did not feel at liberty to reveal Mr. Gade any of the details which Earl had revealed to him. Hence, the interview failed to produce the effect which Ed had hoped for. He went away then, feeling that his office as mediator had utterly failed. On dismissing Devereux with a few kind words, Mr. Gade, leaving the classroom, took his way across the yard to the juniors' students' library. He was within a few feet of the library door when he unexpectedly came upon Earl, still pacing up and down a lonely walk. Earl was advancing toward him. The meeting was inevitable. At first, Mr. Gade was in a state of irresolution about saluting Earl kindly. There was a stony, repellent stare in the boy's eyes as he drew nearer. Would it not be better to pass the troublesome pupil with a cold recognition? Any friendly overture made to Earl in his present exasperated and sullen state of mind would lay the teacher open to a slight. Besides, Earl was the inferior. He should be shown that his present course deserved rebuke. On the other hand, perhaps Eddie Devereux was right, or again, if not altogether right, perhaps there was some truth in his defense of his friend. Moreover, and this was the most important point, a little kindness rarely goes amiss. Mr. Gade resolved, though it cost him a struggle, to try kindness. "Good afternoon, Earl," he said, with a smile and a gentle tone. "Good afternoon," said Earl in surly tones, touching his cap gingerly and walking on. Earl's manner was harsh and repellent. Mr. Gade's courtesy was indeed a courtesy ill returned. I'm afraid that Eddie is wholly wrong, reflected the teacher sadly as he walked on. My attempt at kindness has gone to nothing. Mr. Gade's attempting at kindness may have gone for nothing according to the world's measurement, but according to a higher and holier measurement, it had gone for much. In answering thus uncourteously Mr. Gade's kind salutation, Earl had acted on the ugly spur of the moment and without fully realizing what he was doing. It was only when he had turned his back upon his teacher that a fuller sense of his conduct came upon him. Clear and distinct from the black background of his passion shone the kind eyes which had looked into his momentarily with such sympathy. Clear and distinct from the black background of his passion, the teacher's thin, delicate face, worn with sickness, haunted him, and as that kind of face fastened upon his imagination, the clouds of passion thinned and scattered. How unpardonably rude he had been! He had been boorish. He had returned kindness with bitterness, and tears came to Earl's eyes. A chance had been given him to return to the former footing with his teacher, even to explain everything, and he had thrown it away. Earl was thoroughly humbled. He had been convinced a moment before that he was a persecuted boy, and now he began to entertain doubts. If he could but apologize, alas! He had let his chance escape. The same pride which had led him to act thus discourteously, now, under another shape, stood between him and the making of a full submission. But in his heart there arose a short, earnest prayer to God for grace and light and strength. So Mr. Gade's salutation, though it had brought him a slight, was not without fruit, and Eddie's meditation had not been vain. It had been well said that for every act of kindness performed in this world of ours, there is one sin the less.